One of the main criticisms I see about Bungo Stray Dogs is that it's making a mockery of the real people the characters are based on. I don't entirely disagree with this point, but I think BSD gets far too much slack for it, when there are other series out there that have done the same thing before or just much worse than BSD. Try to break down every example and we'll be here forever, so I'm going to talk about one. And what better example to use than Dazai? Dazai Osamu is one of Japan's most popular writers. His works are incredibly successful in both Japan and internationally to this day. If you're watching this, I'm sure you're familiar with No Longer Human or The Setting Sun. But despite his success, his personal life is nothing short of a tragedy. Born in 1909, Dazai grew up in a wealthy family, but was neglected by his father and sick mother. His mental health took a turn for the worst when Akutagawa committed in 1927, while Dazai was in high school. Dazai idolized Akutagawa, and his death shook him greatly. He began to perform poorly in school and turned to things like alcohol and women to cope. Only 2 years later did he try to commit for the first time. He enrolled in university a year later, but only ended up repeating the same cycle. He also became involved in left-wing politics that the Japanese government was against at the time. He was expelled from the school and attempted a few days later, drowning with a girl named Tanabe. She didn't survive, but Dazai was rescued by a fishing boat. He got married to a geisha, Hatsuyo, shortly after. 5 years later, after again failing to graduate university, he attempted a loan. He survived, became addicted to painkillers, and was locked in a mental institution for a month to help him quit. During this time, his wife cheated on him, so they attempted together. Both survived and they divorced. Dazai met a teacher named Michiko, and they got married and had 3 kids. He avoided being drafted in World War II due to tuberculosis. During this period, his popularity as a writer grew significantly, but he only grew more depressed, turning to alcohol again. He cheated on his wife with a fan of his, Shizuko, and they ended up having a child together. In 1947, he met a woman named Tomie, and ended up leaving his family entirely to be with her. And in 1948, he and Tomie drowned themselves in a canal, this time neither surviving. With the combination of an immensely successful literary career and depressing, tumultuous life attached to the name Dazai, you'd think no one would dare try to use it in any way. But books, shows, movies, and in today's case, anime and manga seem to love portraying him as much as they can. The most well-known adaptation of Dazai is of course Bungo Stray Dogs. Aside from his name, the story includes references to his relationships with other authors, both friends and people he hated, and little aspects of the real Dazai's character, like his likes and dislikes. BSD also depicts his many attempts, albeit as a joke, most of the time. Is this a good representation of the real Dazai? No, not at all. But it's also not trying to be. At no point does Asagiri claim that any of the characters in BSD are supposed to be the real people they are based on. The references are just that, references. So I feel like that leaves some room to be a bit more creative with the characters. Only the authors themselves would be able to definitively answer how they feel about their portrayal in BSD, and we will never find out how they feel because they're all dead. Well, aside from the ones included in Gaiden, but they all seem fine with it. I can't really argue what Asagiri does is fine any more than this, so instead, I'm just gonna throw other stories under the bus. The earliest manga-fied version of Dazai, as far as I'm aware, is from Goodbye Mr. Despair, starting in 2005. The basic plot follows a depressed, pessimistic teacher and his class full of students with every problem under the sun. It's a pretty typical gag manga for the time. Up until the end, at least. If you've ever read anything by this author, you know he loves to chuck in a shocking plot twist in the final hour. While the leading man isn't named Dazai, his character is quite obviously one big reference to him. He attempts many times, miraculously surviving each one, and he loves the idea of a double commitment. There's also little references like his dad being a rich politician and jokes about communism. Plus, the book No Longer Human is mentioned in the series multiple times. You thought BSD was bad with the ending jokes? This has a whole lot more and is handled in a much worse manner. But like BSD, this character is never claimed to be the Dazai, just a fictionalized reference to his life. Because of that, there's significantly less pressure put on the series to be accurate to reality. But what about the series that do claim to include the real Dazai? I can think of 3. Bungo to Alchemist, Reincarnate Osamu Dazai, and No Longer Allowed in Another World. In Bungo to Alchemist, strange creatures are tainting classical books, causing them and their their authors to disappear. To combat this, real authors are transmigrated into a mystical library, gaining various powers to use in battle. Our main character is none other than Dazai. Bunao is mainly a game which I've never played, but it does have an anime adaptation that I have seen and thought was mid. In terms of representing the characters, their relationships, and history, this is quite accurate and informative, but it's also just boring. I think where this failed is the characters' personalities. They're all really flat. Maybe it was just the anime, but I feel like they really dumbed everything down and made it very surface level compared to what it could have been, especially with all the darker themes that come attached to a lot of these authors. Reincarnate Osamu Dazai was a bit hard to read as an English translation does not exist, so I had to do some creative interpretation myself. The gist of it, I think, is that while he was on his way to drown himself in the river, Dazai reincarnated into the modern day. He passes out and gets picked up by a high school girl and stays with her and her family. I'm pretty sure the goal is to win the Akutagawa prize by submitting writing through that girl. Chapter 9 talks about how the idea of Dazai is becoming more popular than he himself. This modern world is the exact same as ours. So guess what? BSD and Bunao exist in it. This panel gave me a heart attack. Boom. BSD, Dazai, Akutagawa, and Oda alongside Bunao, Dazai, and Ango. I did not know that was there before I started writing this video. Could I read half of this? Nope, but it was still much better than I was expecting going in. It's silly, but it talks about Dazai's writing career, how he was influenced by others, and he reflects on himself a lot. And for once, the plot of the story isn't just him wanting to go off himself. And on that high note, I will now present to you pure insanity. In No Longer Allowed in Another World, Dazai, on his way to drown himself, gets hit by a truck and isekai'd into a fantasy world. He wakes up in a chapel greeted by an elf priestess, and immediately tries to off himself again with sleeping pills. The priestess saves him and says he needs to be a hero, but he says he can't. She checks his stats and realizes a sneeze could take this guy out. She says it was her mistake bringing him here and to stay with her, but he leaves, saying he just wants to find a place to die. Apparently that's an ultra effective pickup line because we end with the priestess head over heels for him. And that's just part 1 of chapter 1. The rest of the story boils down to the priestess and some others dragging Dazai around the world in a coffin, all to find his lover he was trying to commit with so they can commit together. They get into a ton of fights and Dazai somehow manages to solve them all by just trying to get himself killed or writing books. The entire thing is exactly as stupid as it sounds, but it was funny and goddamn did they make him hot. So which series is the worst offender? In terms of making a mockery of a real person, it's No Longer Allowed in Another World hands down. Having said that, I don't think any of them are actually doing anything bad for the people they're representing. While they may not do it in the most historically accurate or flattering way, I mean flattering in the sense of poor taste jokes, not, you know. They build interest in these authors. People have decided to read classical literature which they would never have otherwise even thought about reading because of these series. And to me, I can only ever see that as a positive outcome. But that's just my hot take and I would love to hear your thoughts as well. Also, there wasn't a good time to bring it up, so I'm throwing it in at the end. You know Rampo's Japanese voice actor? Well, he voices the main character in Goodbye Mr. Despair and No Longer Allowed in Another World. This man has been Dazai more times than the real Dazai. Anyway, thank you for your time.